Hello everyone, today we talk about on-call time and duty in the Republican Roman army. I decided to divide this, just for the Republican times because eventually things evolved in more complex ways later. I mean, not really substantially because the way troops guarded camps or forts or cities in Republican Roman times were essentially the same um, that existed afterwards. It's just that the organization sometimes was different depending on the actual differences that existed within the Roman army between the Republican and Imperial times. And this is something that could be extended even, I don't know, I will talk definitely about this even for a late antique Roman army and all. The late Roman army. So relatively to this, there was all basically we are aware of a procedure that was the into on-call duty. That every evening, we're talking especially about the camp where the watch was definitely a necessity, much more than in other situations. Very often the camp was placed in front of the enemy or in unfriendly territory. So we have actually a necessity to keep guard pretty seriously, and we know that the Romans cared very much about discipline and especially attributed great importance to the role of sentinels, of watchmen, and seemingly there is an historiography that basing itself on the Roman disciplines regarding to this and the Hellenistic norms from certain statutes that have survived wants to stress essentially um, a greater harshness in Roman discipline compared to the other Hellenistic powers, for which the punishment for being found, for instance, asleep during the watch would have brought to death by even by being clubbed down by your own comrades, and that wasn't, we know it wasn't really the norm. In the sense that at this time the Roman army, we're actually talking also in post-Roman and post-Marian times, but in previous times was more like a sort of militia, and we can argue that even before the Augustan reforms, especially many roles weren't really canonized, formalized. Like even the role of centurions is something that had always been there, but the idea of the professional centurion and the hierarchy of non-commissioned officers is something that finds its true settlement, especially at the time of from the time of Caesar onwards, even though there can be some debate. Usually the Marian reform basically gave free hand to a more stabilized structure and permanent structure into the Roman army, but really it's really the permanence of such organization is something that we see usually from Caesar, from the civil wars, and eventually with the reforms of Augustus that really wanted to settle a broad systematization of the forces. And that's the reason why we know relatively also less about Republican discipline, by the way, because also the Romans before the 2nd century BC didn't really write much on their own. Um, if we hadn't had Polybius, for instance, we'd had to largely rely, even for the times of the Punic Wars, on very late accounts that were in turn based on Polybius himself. Just for saying that we don't really know much about things work, and today especially we will see how this is kind of compensated, um, let's say historiographically speaking, by the integration to what we know about the Roman army of other treatises that had their own importance at the time, but that had been written in in Greece, for instance. And today's we will be quoting especially Aeneas Tacticus, that had been living in 4th century BC. So basically, in the Roman forts, during every evening, the optio was a soldier of the Roman army. It was essentially a centurion's assistant. The maniple had two, together with 2 centurions for every century. But it was also the optio assisted also the decurions of cavalry. So the cavalry commanders. So they were part of those of that restricted group of of non-commissioned officers called principales or principales, how you want to call it. I usually say always first the pronunciatio restituta, which is how we think the Romans really spoke. Then I associate even second also the ecclesiastical pronunciation, because we actually don't know whether everything was hard, like so if you hear me repeating two names, it's not because I don't we don't really know indeed what the real pronunciation was, but it's because I give both, so you can choose which one you want to express. So the optio of every maniple basically accompanied into the tent of the tribune that was in charge of the army, the soldier that had the duty of taking the first turn of guard. The tribune at that point would give to him 4 tassels, that 4 badges in practice, with a mark on them, every one of which corresponded to one of the 4 turns of guard. So basically the soldier kept for himself just the first badge, and eventually he distributed the remaining ones to the other 3 were in charge of the other 3 turns, and the badges had to be given to by the sentinel, basically to the guy that was in charge of the rounds, that came checking if the sentinel was out there, and when he in fact would come in for his inspection. So there was both a sentinel system that was overwatched by rounds, and the night watch turns were called Vigiliae, Vigiliae or Vigiliae, that I was searching for the etymology of that it is essentially, however, being vigil in practice, and so the meaning is really that one. And by the way, in Roman times, the Vigiliae or Vigiliae were also in civilian life the term used to express the hours of the night. So the night was conceived in those times before the invention of mechanical clocks, public clocks, let's say, in the Middle Ages, the moment in which there was no light during the whole day. So it was split into 4 periods that were equal compared to each other. and they and obviously these meant that they differed during the times of the year. So the Vigiliae of the winter Vigiliae could be of 4 hours during while the summer ones could be of just 2 hours. So in order to establish really more or less correctly at least the length of the Vigiliae, there were certain systems of times mensuration, chiefly hourglasses. So they were made up of two glass containers that communicated through a little hole, a little passage. That's a normal hourglass is practically made. And Aeneas Tacticus, in this sense, he wrote a. Aeneas Tacticus is probably the first really treatises of military art in history. He wrote this work that was called the Polyaenus, that literally means in Greek the defense of a besieged city. And that was in many ways the reference for all the following works on the subject. As we were saying before, he was from the 4th century. He mostly wrote from a Greek military perspective, but this treaty was so well renowned that it obviously circulated. Surely the Roman elites who knew how to speak Greek at the time were, at least since the 2nd, 1st century BC, that were getting Hellenized in education. They knew this thing. And the treatises are a bit it's not that they were really practical things. I mean, usually, yeah, there are certain advice in them that is really good, as we will be seeing, but we have to think that warfare at the time was something so frequent, so normal into the political dialectics that there was always a bunch of people who knew how things had to be carried out, and treatises were relatively theoretical. And these are actually, at least one of Aeneas Tacticus is really very detailed. The Roman treatises, especially one of the Byzantine era, are kind of more sometimes they meet the same degree of detail, but there are lots of things, especially relatively to the lower to the duties and that had to be carried out by non-commissioned officers and by the troop, that were kind of skipped because eventually those were treatises written at court for people who were only in charge of armies and really didn't bother themselves with smaller details, although you can still find them. And this is a bit of a problem also for studying the military history of that time, especially during the Middle Ages, not just about the Byzantines, but even about the West. We know that, yeah, there were military treatises that were written, and also some that were read from the ancient era, but most of these were theoretical, because maybe they weren't written really by people who meant them as practical things. I mean, maybe there were certain authors that just wanted to imitate an ancient an ancient work, or to line up in a historiographical tradition of treatises writing, and that therefore that without even having a great military experience, of maybe even having it, but just sticking to those models and not really getting into further details. Here we're relatively luckier, but we have, as I was saying before, to compensate with such different works in times and space for this time of the Roman army, because we don't know much. And generally speaking, we don't really know much about the Roman army in itself. Like, people sometimes that do not get into sources kind of say, oh well, but yeah, these are things we know, right? There is someone who knows how the Romans fought, how they were. Yeah, we know actually a lot of things. We're lucky about that, but we don't really know precisely how most of the things worked, and therefore we have to proceed by analogy, and it happens really, really quite often. So Aeneas Tacticus, I quote 2224, advised the usage of an hourglass that was divided into 4 sections. So meaning that basically every turn basically ended when the water level reached a certain sign that had been prefixed marked over in the hourglass, so very simply made. This is also interesting, by the way, because it shows that at least at similar latitudes, like the one of Southern Europe, where the most advanced civilizations lived at the time, were kind of similar under this point of view. I mean, there were substantially similar hours of similar ways of time checking in practice. I mean, they were pretty much all the same in the world when they decided to measure, like hourglasses. You can find them pretty much elsewhere, but probably what I mean here is that there were certain time measures that were pretty close between, say, the Greeks and the Romans for latitudinal reasons. And in fact, when Caesar went, I'm quoting from the Bello Gallico 513, when he went to Britain, well, he noticed that the mesurations that were done with water hourglasses, the British nights were much shorter than on the continent during summer, of course. So and this is interesting because Caesar writes comparing to the continent, but really, I mean, even if the Romans went from Rome to Cisalpine Gaul or from Rome to Sicily, since Italy is pretty long in latitude, they would have noticed, and obviously it was obvious. You can argue that the majority of people didn't travel much at such distances, but I mean, merchants, people who traveled, they perfectly knew such things. And the fact that Caesar was writing something like this is not that he didn't know. I'm pretty sure that he knew that even before going to Britain, or maybe, I don't know, it's just speculating, but maybe this was just an information because he wanted to show a curiosity to the Roman to the Roman population that kind of entertained them even while reading the Bello Gallico. And you shouldn't really say, oh well, but because it's like saying that he was stupid enough not to ever notice that. And Caesar was a pretty solidly educated person. There was a lot of ethnographical interest at the time already into classical literature. And the Bello Gallico in many places, in many parts, actually falls into this category. When he speaks about the Germans, about the Gauls, and these naturalistical things were evidently set there even to make the reading pleasant in practice, because it wasn't something written functionally like a military treaty. It was really a political work to show certain things about the Gallic society, the other peoples that lived around, in order to be integrated into the Roman system, which is what Caesar in his side, in his political mindset had clear in mind. So all things that kind of even attracted like the curiosity of the Roman reader. Um, and Polybius instead writes that the duty of making the Vigiliae being basically resounding at night, acoustically speaking, to allow the guards to switch, was entrusted to the Primus Pilus. The Primus Pilus was the first spear centurion. So a very prestigious charge into the legion, and that evidently was and marking the hours was really something so important that a man such as the Primus Pilus, with a responsibility like the one he had basically to do, even as an honor, as a privilege in practice. And he had to know best, because these were non-commissioned officers that basically arose from the ranks, who knew exactly the importance of military life in even these relatively little things that really, however, were so important for the security of the camp or the garrisons or wherever they were. In later times, instead we find the progressive the presence of another figure, that is the one of the Orologiarius or Orologarius, that had probably the duty to communicate to the trumpet, to, I don't know how to say that, the trumpet player, I can't say, to sound the signal of the Vigilia. And so the service of runs, of night runs, was usually carried out by cavalry. I don't really know on which base we can say this, but it's pretty obvious that cavalry has one advantage, that it can reach up the various distances of the camp's perimeter that had pretty consistent dimensions. So even if something was going wrong, maybe the sentinels had been taken out by the enemy or something like that, they could run faster than a guy on foot that would have made wasting precious time. So the decurion that was at the head of the first turma of each legion. The legion had the turmae or turme as this small cavalry contingents. By the way, the Romans preferred at this point to draw their cavalries mostly from the allies, and the legion was basically a solely infantry force. The turmae were mostly used not much as a shock force, but as a kind of a linking personnel, like for communications, and also some cavalry had to be there. And in this sense, it's interesting that it was used into this fashion. So the decurion called that was at the head of the first turma of each legion entrusted in the early morning one of his optiones or optiones, so his assistants, to designate 4 soldiers, one for each for each turn of watch, or vigilia, as we have seen, to carry out the round. So to check out the sentinels, what we're doing. So before the evening of the same day, the decurion of the first turma had to notificate to the decurion of the second turma um, that it had to it was now his turn basically to organize the run service for the day after. So this was this kind of passage of duty that was also formally sanctioned by this timing that evidently had to work pretty well. It was very mechanical, and it was done really to ensure that everybody did their duty, because probably it's not that these guys didn't know, but it's pretty much obvious that, especially coming from a non-professional army like the Roman one for a certain time in Republican times practically was, the lack of a permanent um, you know, of a permanent body of officers and non-commissioned officers was could basically had caused troubles in this sense in organization. So it was something, this kind of passage of duty had to be done openly, so that also others could see, that there could be witnesses, and that therefore nobody could say, well, but I didn't know I had to organize the run at this point, or I hadn't sent this man to do their duty. So, and it was a very strong responsibility relatively to that, because if things eventually got wrong, because maybe exactly on that occasion the enemy breached in because of the lack of sentinels, or the lack of control of the sentinels by the runs, the responsibility was over these non-commissioned officers, and they risked directly because of that. So in turn, the decurion of the second turma had to, in the same way, to carry out what the one of the first turma had done, and to transmit the duty for the following days to the other decurions. And this is how it practically worked. So the 4 men that were chosen by the decurion were chosen really randomly through I don't know how they, by um, um, sorting out, lotting, I don't know how, and in this sense they had to accordingly to inspect the relative watch points and the hours at which they they had to carry out that duty. So they they eventually lodged by the first maniple of the Triarii. Because why the Triarii? Well, the Triarii usually at this time, so we're talking in pre-Marian times, but even if the term actually remained within the maniples, that maniples practically remained from an organizational point of view in terms of organics into the Roman army, even when the cohort was formally sanctioned with under the Marian reform, which already existed before, by the way. But the Triarii were kind of we can say the least engaged guys of the situation, were usually the older troops, the ones who saw least action, who also operated in the rears, in the rear of the legion. So there were, in this sense, it seems that they were the least busy troops, and it was the primus pilus of the first maniple of the Triarii that had the I can't find words today. I think it's the task of to make sounding the change of the guard. And so the signal of the first Vigilia at night was sorted. Excuse me, that who had been sorted as the first guy of the night, of the first turn of round. He had to go accompanied by witnesses. This is very important. So the who carried out the round had certain witnesses that had to acknowledge what they would have seen with him. So the sentinels, the inspected sentinels, they had to show their badges, and if one of them had fallen asleep, or it wasn't even found on the spot on the guard, the head of the round made the witnesses constate the fact, and he went on, in his own round. So this is important because it practically, you might say, well, but shouldn't they have left someone there? Well, yes, but in that occasion it could have as well happened that something had gone wrong maybe elsewhere. So they had to check out also the other sentinels if everything was alright. The important thing was to say, okay, this guy now is missing, or maybe we have found him asleep, and then to pass on to the next watchman. And so and those were actually pretty serious problems eventually for the sentinel. As we have said before, they could even be sentenced to death by clubbing. And however, I didn't conclude. Well, we'll talk about that later. So and the same thing was done by the other runs of the following turns. So at dawn, all those who had carried out the run during the various Vigiliae took to the tribune the badges that they had taken by the sentinels. Everyone they found, and if some and that was a pretty good thing to do, because that was possibly the only way to show that the same runs men had done their duty. So passing to every sentinel that had to give all the various badges at every during their Vigilia to prove that they had been there. And if someone was missing, the interesting thing is that from the signs of the on the badges that had been brought could allow it basically to you could see who was missing. So which unit to determine, and eventually determining which unit was the responsible one. And in this eventuality, the relative centurion was called. So he would bring the soldiers that had been appointed for the various turns of guards that were confronted with the ones who had carried out the run. So the eventual responsibility of the sentinel had to be confirmed by the witnesses that that were in the round. Otherwise, it was the same head of the rund that was considered as responsible for the missing badge. So this was it sounds pretty complicated, but actually it's pretty simple in practice. Yeah, there were still certain ways you could maybe skipping this, in the sense that maybe during the night being there these four Vigiliae, if maybe one of the soldiers, one of the sentinels was well, actually these were sorted. So the point here is that probably these guys didn't know each other. Considering that in the legion there were many people, so probably some of them could know each other, but the fact that they were sorted probably made it more difficult. So even kind of tricking the whole system by the the actual um, um, you know, um, the accordance, let's say the previous accordance between the sentinel and the rund could be could yeah, it's still theoretically feasible, but it's something rare, especially considering that you have to do it every night. So people are changing continuously every day, and that was the reason why all that complicated procedure was carried out. And this actually stresses how important these runs practically were under this point of view, and how they were the camp's safety was considered vital, and really rightfully by the Romans. Aeneas Tacticus gives us certain other prescriptions that in this sense apply to the Greek army of the 4th century about which he was writing, but that they're surely known by the Romans, and at least in similar ways, and used them in practice, or maybe eventually even imported, not maybe just by the treaty, but simply because it was something, I don't know, the Romans definitely knew the Greek world, they fought in there as well, so they knew how to organize an army, and they they probably even didn't need that influence. But and we have to think always that there are similar needs that are responded to in similar ways. Also, if these are the simplest, and there isn't much in practice to differentiate. The Aeneas Tacticus says one very interesting thing is that those who had to carry out the rund during the first turn of God, they had to carry out the service without having eaten, because according to him, basically the men of the first turn, if they have already eaten, which would happen usually before going to sleep, evenly before the night, are kind of more they're more tired. They are on digestion, and therefore they are indolent and less disciplined, also seemingly. So the rund, and this is interesting that also the idea of discipline is kind of put out here, in the sense that maybe when you have eaten, you feel, I don't know, sleepy also, considering that it happened at night as well, and all, but why less discipline? Maybe they wanted, maybe if you are on your digestion, you do not want to argue to ruin the digestion, but it's possible, really. And at least we find this this indication. The Also, he states that the run has to be carried out without lanterns, so without lights, unless the weather is too bad. I mean, there is a scarce visibility, or the darkness of the night is complete. Indeed, it could happen that if there is a cloudy night, there is no light around, you necessarily need to bring lanterns with you, but otherwise it's preferable not to show lights. And the best way was maybe to bring actually a lantern with you, because there could be still situations in which you might have needed that if something was wrong. Maybe, I don't know, it's like 50-50, because maybe you're spotted more easily by the enemy, but at the same time you might look at the enemy in that sense. So what he said is just cover the lantern. So with something, whatever it is, so that at least the light doesn't project upwards, so implicitly on the guys' faces, but downwards. Sorry, downwards, so that it can lighten up only the terrain around the feet. And this is interesting also because even if you lighten the terrain just around your feet, you're still spottable in some fashion. But at least it doesn't really tell much about how many of you is around, in the sense that light, and here it has to go just downwards, and the terrain, and to light up the terrain. So not people were coming, I don't know, by the sides, unless they're not enough close, or the faces, as we were saying. And following these recommendations, that was it. And this recommendation was kind of useful, obviously for not being spotted by the enemy, but there were also other things that could be done. For instance, when inspection is not possible, which can happen, because maybe you have to, up to now we have been thinking about a context like the one of a camp, of an entrenched, fortified camp. So a place that was actually built up to allow some form of patrol paths around the perimeter, stuff like that. But when this patrolling is not it's not possible, because maybe the guards that you have placed are maybe you have placed the guards in a point into which they have to remain all night, maybe making turnation between themselves, sleeping one at a time, because maybe the terrain is particularly difficult. It's useless to send our people there for a longer time, or maybe there is an enemy in the middle, something like that. That can happen, definitely. There was a way that instead is advised by Polyaenus from his Stratagemata, I believe, 40 and 3. There was another suggestion that was basically to watch the guardsmen from an elevated ground, so at distance, and and to basically raise up a lantern, like a signal, and watch if the sentinels kind of they signal back by moving their own lanterns, so that commanders can see which which places are not being guarded at that moment, which can happen because the sentinel has fallen asleep, or maybe because an enemy has killed him, or whatever. But just to say how recurrent these problems practically were, and the security of camps is really something crucial, because if an enemy attacks, well, everybody's is asleep, and there is nobody really you know, communicating that, launching the alarm. It's pretty difficult that you can recover without many losses. All the disorganization that is present in a non-combat situation. However, relatively to this last point, Aeneas Tacticus talks also about, gives a lesson that I find very interesting, and that really tells how deep these authors were relatively to human psychology, but also to the real practice of warfare, so not just to idealistic statements. Aeneas writes, if an army, I'm paraphrasing now, but he basically writes this: if an army finds itself in dire conditions for instance, for a defeat in battle, for the great number of losses because of the wounded or the defection of allies. So if there is a shortage of in manpower, and there is, generally speaking, a factor that basically brings down morale and commitment, the or maybe when the enemies are close. So when there is a situation that actually is quite present into warfare. Sometimes we think about warfare as this, especially for the ancient world, just this massive battles, pitched battles that are decided by the two sides, and everybody's lined up and all. But really, the majority of the average situation in warfare is a continuous guerrilla situation, into which the enemy is out there, especially at night in the dark, and you don't know where it is, and there is a lot of tension, and you don't know what to do, and they can assault from a moment to another. So all situations that are very very tough, because they put up a psychological pressure that is very difficult to cope with. World War I veterans were definitely aware of this. They were scared actually more by the weight between a charge and another than about the actual charge, because that was at least a moment of relief, of anxiety, a moment into which adrenaline kicked in once again, and you maybe felt a bit better, even if you were going just to be butchered down by machine gun fire. Well, this is something that really happened in all times in history, at least ever since warfare exists in practice, and it's very interesting that Aeneas Tacticus really thinks about this. And what he says in practice is that in such conditions the rounds have to be carried out, and possibly also frequently, because if the enemy is just out there, you necessarily have to guard against him. But without the specific task to basically to essentially harass the sentinels, because basically these sentinels are placed up out there without any in extremely difficult situations already. So he says basically that you don't have to punish those who you find asleep or because they are tired and they're just trying to rest a little. And because he says in these conditions the best thing you can do for the army is actually to give them a bit of rest, psychophysically, and you can benefit more from that than from keeping up this like Martinet discipline that that in this case can be more harmful than useful, because it's gonna add anxiety up to the one that the soldiers already have. So in order to keep up, however, a certain form into this, the sentinels basically have to be aware of the approaching of the runs. So in order to these sentinels to basically wake up before the runs arrive, you can make this maybe the commander coming in a certain run, maybe together with known men. And when instead the army find themselves in a different situation from this, so to which into which instead there is no excuse essentially for being lenient and all, you have to carry out the runs in a much more pressing way. So and it also adds, do not make the runs always at the same hours, because otherwise the sentinels will know that and just wake up in time for pretending that they are awake throughout all the night. And therefore, so that you don't let them know when the round will arrive, and you will keep them hopefully awake all the night. So this is more or less what I wanted to really to tell, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel for receiving further news about my contents. For now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye!